what's happened as we've been living through this COVID-19 thing is that a lot of our churches have begun to figure out technology in ways they never have before, from Zoom meetings to Facebook Live to YouTube Live to all kinds of stuff. And a lot of these efforts have been valiant, have been awesome, have been quick and adaptive and all kinds of wonderful things. And now that we're kind of settling into this, some people are beginning to ask questions like, okay, so if we're going to keep doing this after this is over, what do we need to think about? Because one of the observations I've made is we're not going to go back, right? Like, if this were a 1 week thing, like if this had been a really bad blizzard or something, we just could have gone back to what was normal. But by the time that this is done, we're going to have done this a minimum of 6 weeks. I mean, I'm guessing way more than that. I'm just saying minimum of 6, probably 8 weeks, and we may be. It's not unlikely that we might even end up doing this again in the fall if there's another outbreak. There's so much that we don't know. So a lot of our congregations are beginning to think, okay, what should we be thinking about and what should we be thinking about now? And I think one of the things to really keep in mind is that if you are looking at online church, virtual church, streaming, whatever, as simply something for your flock to keep them connected, then you really don't need to worry about much of production value, right? Like, your people probably don't care a whole lot about the production value of your Zoom meeting or even your live stream. They're happy to have something. They're happy to be able to participate in some way to remain connected, all that kind of stuff. It's not saying that production value is like not useful here, but it's not like vital. Okay, it's not like absolutely mission critical. But if you're thinking of doing live streaming virtual worship into the future as like a key component of the way that your church does church, be it for outreach, be it for families who aren't able to get to church as often, et cetera, et cetera. If you're going to do this, then production value does become really, really important, because especially for visitors, for newcomers, poorly done video goes a long way toward driving people away. So the model that I kind of want to talk through today is to look at live streaming in 5 different parts. Now, just some background. So some of you watching this know this, some of you don't. But my background, actually, before I went into ministry full time, was in the areas of physics and computer science. That's actually what my undergraduate degree is in. So I have some background in the technology side of this, to say the least. But also, I ran for a number of years a camera rental company. So I understand cameras. I understand some of this stuff quite well because I lived this stuff. Bought this equipment and have worked with people who have done live streaming stuff before. So basically, I'm going to talk kind of through 5 parts of live streaming, or 5 components, 5 pieces to get live streaming to where it needs to be. And here they are. You need to think about camera or cameras and sound. You need to think about a switcher or a capture device, a computer or some type of streaming device, your internal network connection, and your upstream internet connection. So those are kind of the 5 big parts. Here we go. So the first one is to think about camera or cameras. Are you going to be using a single camera, or are you thinking going much more so and like putting a couple different cameras in your sanctuary? Okay. Either's fine. I've seen churches do it really well both ways. Keep in mind, when you get into multiple cameras, you're going to scale your budget really fast. Because most likely you're looking at kind of multiple cameras that can be remote controlled from a single location, and you're also requiring a higher level of human capital investment. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that live streaming requires human capital. It requires the investment of people, the involvement of people who aren't you as the pastor, right? I'm thinking most of the time it's pastors who are watching this. You can't be responsible for making sure that the live stream works. You have to be able to hand it off completely, so it requires a human investment, human resources as well. The more complicated you get, the more human investment it's going to require. So if you're going to do multiple cameras, great. Know that you're basically going to need at least one full-time person there managing your live stream the whole time. Switching between different camera angles, adjusting cameras. There are some great cameras out there for doing that. There's some great remote control cameras where you can remotely adjust the zoom and that kind of stuff. They're great, but that's at the high end. Most of you are going to want to think about a single camera format, where simply you have one video camera that you put in a fixed place and that you then just kind of move it, or someone back there moving it, as you know, from the center of your chancel or your stage or your platform to your pulpit and your lectern and things like that. So that's what most of you are probably going to want to kind of consider to start with, is a single camera. that you put in the back of the sanctuary. And because we're talking about the back of the sanctuary, that gets to our second point of zoom. You need a camera that zooms, and preferably a camera that zooms electronically, okay? So if you have a camera that requires a manual zoom, so like here, sitting next to me, I have my DSLR. This is a great camera. I would do a great job live streaming, actually, but it's got a manual zoom. And that's a little harder to operate than a traditional digital video camera that has a power zoom on it, that has a little slider that zooms in and out. So what you can do live streaming with DSLRs, and I'll talk about that 2 bullets down, it's not necessarily my recommendation. My recommendation is to go with a traditional video camera because they're just better suited for doing broadcast type stuff like what we're talking about. The next thing you're going to want to think about is support. In other words, how are you going to mount this? And it's going to depend everything on kind of where you want to mount it. One of the easiest things is that if you have a sound booth, mount it at your sound booth. That's going to get into the next slide I'm going to talk about. Mount it in your sound booth. If you can get it in anywhere close to your audio system, whatever you're using for sound, the closer you get it to that, the better off it is. So maybe it's a tripod. You don't need a really expensive tripod for this kind of stuff. I'm going to have a setup at the end that's basic. It's $60. You don't need a really fancy tripod. You can spend a lot of money on tripods, but you don't need a really fancy tripod. It is helpful to have one that's called a fluid head tripod because those pan smoothers. So if you think about kind of a traditional Presbyterian sanctuary, and you've got the chancel area up front, and maybe you do the announcements from the top of the steps, and then you have a lay reader or a liturgist off to the right, and then you have the sermon coming from the left. It's nice to have something that kind of smoothly rotates between those spots. So it's helpful to have a fluid head tripod, but you don't need to spend a lot of money. Now, when I say a lot of money, I'm thinking less than $200. Okay, tripods easily can get into 300, 400, 500, thousands of dollars. But I'm saying a good fluid head tripod can cost you probably less than $200 to do this. The other thing you may want to think about is something called a monopod. A monopod is like a tripod in that you can mount a camera to it, but a monopod is just one leg. And what you can do with a monopod is that you can mount it to something. So when I was at Hampton, we mounted a monopod in the sound booth and used brackets to mount it into a wall so that it didn't take up a lot of room, right? Because a tripod spreads out at the bottom. A monopod doesn't. A monopod takes up less space, but you have to have something to secure it to. So it all depends kind of on your space, whether you're going to want to do a tripod or a monopod. The last thing is you're going to need to look at something that has what's called clean HDMI output or SDI, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But for most people, you're looking for HDMI, which is the same type of connection that comes out of cable boxes and streaming devices and goes into your TV. You're going to need to be looking for a camera that offers what's called clean HDMI out. Now, what does it mean by clean? HDMI out can have what's called menu information. So if you're using, again, like a DSLR camera like this, oftentimes those will output menu information. So it'll tell you your settings and things like that. You don't want that for live streaming. You want something that offers clean HDMI out. This is why going with a traditional video camera is better. Because traditional video cameras, even the cheapest ones, offer clean HDMI out. They don't have the menu settings on it. To get clean HDMI out on a DSLR camera, on something that looks like this, you've got to spend a little more money. Now, it's coming down in price a little bit, but again, these aren't the best because of the manual zoom, and there's a whole bunch of technical reasons why these aren't the best for doing live streaming, why really a traditional video camera is a way better way to go. SDI is another way to do this. If you're looking at a much higher end setup where you're going to have longer cable runs and multiple cameras, you're going to get into SDI cables. But if that's where you're going, please reach out to me directly. That gets into a whole different ballgame that most of you, for starting out, aren't really going to need to worry about. Okay. Next, this is the most overlooked part of live streaming or video production in general, and that is not the video, it is the sound. Sound makes or breaks your live stream. I know it sounds funny because isn't it a video? It is, but sound makes or breaks it. And the best option, this is an option that I'm almost willing to sacrifice anything else for, is to take an output from your existing sound system into your live stream. So if you have a soundboard, Most of them will have an aux out, aux 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can even split the headphone jack that your sound guy wears, whatever you do. Find a way to take the output from your sound system and feed it right into your live stream. What this does is it automatically turns every microphone you have into a mic for your live streaming. If you put a second audio system in, or heaven forbid you're trying to just use the audio that comes in through your camera, you're not going to get good quality sound, and here's the reason. We talked about how in a sanctuary setup, you need to have your live streaming setup in the back. Because it has to be in the back, you've got to zoom in. That's why we need a zoom lens on the camera. But in addition to zooming, you also are then farther away sound-wise. So some of you have had pretty good luck with live streaming because you've been using your cell phone. And you set your cell phone up here and you're here. That's great. That's a couple feet. And your cell phone can pick up decent audio that far away. But when you're talking 60, 80, 100, 150, 200 feet, especially in these cavernous sanctuaries that most of us have, you're going to get horrible sound like straight out of the camera. So find a way, please, to take something out of your existing sound system and feed it straight into your live stream. It will save you so much hassle. It will be so much easier. The quality will be so much better. And there's multiple ways to do that. Again, it depends on kind of how your sound system is set up. I know some of you are saying, Brian, I don't have a soundboard. Even out of like your amplifier or whatever drives your speakers, sometimes there's an extra output on that you can grab. It's going to kind of depend on what you have, but this is the most important thing, is to try and find a way to use your existing sound system to tie into your live stream. Okay, so now you've picked up the video and the audio. That's kind of where you start. But now you've got to figure out, how do we digitize this or redigitize it and get it out to the internet? And what this means is that you are going to be using some kind of switcher or capture device. Now, if you do multiple cameras, you need a switcher, which allows you to change the angles. I'm going to kind of focus on the next one, and that is something that is a capture device that will capture what you have. And actually, I think I have one right here in my drawer. So this is the Elgato HD60. This is a capture device, and if you look at it, it has an HDMI input on the one side and a USB port on the other. And this plugs into my laptop and plugs in from the output from my camera, and then it feeds the signal into my computer. Okay, so I'm using a computer to live stream. And you don't have to do that. There's actually other options there. But the easiest option to start is to find a device like this, and there's multiple ones. There's a bunch on Amazon that plugs into the computer via USB and hooks the HDMI in from your camera. Some of you are going to say, but I have an HDMI port on my laptop. You do. That's an HDMI output. It's not an HDMI input. I don't know of any laptops that have an HDMI input on them for normal use. So you're going to need some kind of capture device. There's a ton of options here. You can go relatively affordable, and again, we're talking 100, 150 bucks for most of this stuff, or you can get into much more powerful devices that are designed for multiple sources and things like that for a couple $100, and then you can get into devices that are thousands of dollars for like full-on broadcast work. But to start, you want to find a USB device that's going to tie into a computer. Maybe. It's a good place to start. The other thing, though, is that you're going to either need a computer or you're going to need some kind of what's called an encoder. Okay, so they now make, and they're not that expensive, dedicated devices that connect both to your network and to your cameras, so you don't have to use a laptop. Okay, the easiest way to start is just get something like this, hook it to your laptop, and start streaming, or hook it to a computer and start streaming. The problem is that streaming actually takes a fair amount of power from a computer. Even if you have a device like this that does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, I still find that that my laptop, which is a couple years old but has a pretty powerful processor in it, still can struggle to do some of the live streaming work, to keep up and keep pushing that signal out. So there are some encoders that are dedicated. Now, you have to have something that then controls the encoder. So you still need a computer, you still need a tablet. There's multiple ways that these things work. But you're either looking at like an all-in-one capture and encoding device, or you're looking at a USB-based capture device and a laptop. The all-in-one encoding devices cost more, but they eliminate a variable, right? So now you don't have a capture device and a computer, you just have that encoder. But the other option is simpler. So I was looking real quick before I started this, and like these are running like 150, an all-in-one encoder is running like 250 to 300. Probably the all-in-one encoder is the better option because it's one less variable that can go wrong. That being said, they are a little harder to use, and some people find these capture devices with kind of a familiar software interface all the more just all the more familiar, and therefore all the more easier to use. Okay. Next, we're going to get into this, and this is actually parts 4 and 5 because there's two parts to your network, and both are critically important. The one is the connection within your building or within your facility to your cable modem, to your router, like whatever terminology you're familiar with, where basically your internet connection comes in and you can tie into it. Wireless connections are the worst when it comes to live streaming. They really are. They're not stable. They can be fast, but not stable, okay? So I want you to think about an internet connection like a roller coaster, okay? You can have a really fast roller coaster that has huge drops and gets a lot of speed and is really smooth to ride. Or you can ride an old wooden coaster that goes really fast and shakes a whole lot, right? A wireless connection is a wooden roller coaster. You can go really fast and it can be really fun, but it's not stable. Right? You're going to get intermittent, you're going to get interference, you're going to get all kinds of things that can go wrong with wireless connections. Wired connections are far more stable. They're self-enclosed, it's all in one cable, and if you can plug in to your router, that is the best way to live stream. If you can't, the building just won't allow it, then you really have to think about two things. One, you've got to think about how close can I get to my router, or can I move my router? And do I have a router that supports 5G? Okay, now this is not the same 5G that you hear about with cellular networks. They're different technologies, they're not the same thing. But can I use 5G? 5G has a way higher bandwidth limit than traditional 2.4 gigahertz networks. Okay, so old school wireless networks run on the 2.4 gigahertz signal spectrum. The newer ones all run on 5 gigahertz signal spectrums. To give you an idea, in my house, I have a 2.4 gigahertz network for older devices, and that has a theoretical limit of 54 megabits per second. Theoretically. My 5G network, I'm able to get real-time 300 megabits per second. So I can, even in my house, do 6 times the maximum of the theoretical of the older network standard with a newer network. So you may have to upgrade your router. If you can't plug in, right, plugging in is the top choice. If you can't plug in, then you may need to upgrade your router. The other intermediate solution is to wire as far as you can and then add a second router in what's called an access point mode that then allows you to wirelessly connect to that to reduce down that distance. So there's a couple options. Wireless is the last option. Wired's the best, and maybe moving an access point closer so that if you have to use wireless, you can. That's the best. The last piece is to think about your upstream internet connection. So all of us in our internet providers have two different speeds, downstream and upstream. And most of us on a week-to-week basis only realize our downstream connection. That's the speed at which you are able to connect and download from the internet, that you're able to receive a signal. That's not important for live streaming. What's important for live streaming is what's called your upstream internet connection. And in a lot of internet service provider packages, the upstream connection is way slower. So I know when I was at Hampton, our downstream was 20 megabits per second, our upstream was 3 megabits per second, right? That's not fast enough for live streaming. Live streaming requires at least 2.5 megabits per second of dedicated bandwidth. In other words, bandwidth that no one else can use. So if you've got other devices, if you have other people on your Wi-Fi, they're chewing up bandwidth as you're trying to live stream, right? This is why wiring in is so much better, because it can give you a dedicated secure signal. But more so, you've got to have a greater amount of bandwidth to which to do live streaming. So here's the deal. You may need to call up your internet provider, Comcast, Verizon, whoever your DSL provider is, and find out what speeds do I have. If you have anything less than 10 megabits per second, 10, that's the minimum that I would ever recommend you try and live stream with. 5 is that's really, really close. Assuming that every other variable is good, 5 is really close, but 10 gives you a fighting chance. My honest recommendation, go higher. 25 megabits per second upstream, 50. The more overhead you give, the more margin that you give in your upstream connection, the more flexibility you're going to have in case there's hiccups all along the way, right? The best setup is wire everything from start to finish. That's the best setup. What you want to do is minimize the number of things that can go wrong, and the way to do that is to give you the biggest pipe that's leaving your facility. So call your internet service provider, find out what's your package, find out there's a website called speedtest.net. You actually can go on speedtest.net and run a speed test and find out, not even theoretically, but actually what kind of upstream and downstream connections you're getting, and it can kind of tell you how stable your signal is. In fact, I will run a speed test for you to show you what I mean here when I'm done. So that's it. The last thing, and I don't want to talk about this in this video because it gets into a little bit more of your preference, but is figuring out what platform you want to use. YouTube Live, Facebook Live. That's a little bit different kind of depending on what you're doing. YouTube Live is a little better suited for like a traditional broadcast. YouTube Live is a little bit better for interaction. There's pros and cons to both. But it's not really a technical decision, it's more of a strategic ministry decision, so that's why I don't want to talk about that in this video. So let me give you an idea, just kind of a basic setup that you might try. The first is, and this shows my bias, I am most familiar with Canon. So Sony, Panasonic, there's a lot of good camcorders out there. People in your congregation, your techie people, they may be more familiar with something else. I'm not saying Canon's the only one, please don't hear that. I just know Canon the best because that's what I've owned and used. So, but I would start with something like a Canon RF 800 camcorder. It's an HD camcorder. It offers HDMI out. It can be plugged in via AC power. That's actually one thing I forgot. Most DSLRs like this can't be powered off of AC, like plugged into a wall without doing some extra steps. Whereas a traditional camcorder can. So it plugs into a wall. It has a SD card slot, so you can record the service to the SD card and stream it. The Manfrotto tripod I talked about, the cheapest one that I know of that's good is about 60 bucks. That one's actually not a fluid head tripod. So where I post some suggestions, I'll put in a link to a good Manfrotto tripod. Elgato Game Capture HD60S, very similar to the one that I have. Again, used to be able to find them on Amazon. Now that everyone's live streaming, they've been sold out for weeks. But some kind of capture device that you can plug in. Try it with an existing computer. There's no use sinking a ton of money into this until you kind of know what you want to do. A wired network connection or close proximity to using a 5G network, and again that 10 megabit per second upstream internet connection. So that's kind of a basic setup. You're probably looking at least 500 for the top 3 pieces of equipment. You might not need anything else to get to the rest. For a testing purpose, you might just want to test this out by buying a 100-foot Ethernet cable and plugging it into your router and plugging it into your computer and seeing what you can do, right? This is going to be some experimenting, some trial and error, trying to figure out what might work. During this whole thing, I've actually been doing a decent amount of live streaming right from here in my upstairs office in my house, and I've learned some things. So here, I always wire my laptop in. I don't need to. I've got a really fast wireless connection. I still find a wired signal is way better. The last thing that I just want to touch on briefly is to think carefully about lighting. I didn't say that at the beginning, and I should have. Lighting's really important. A lot of our sanctuaries are dark, and that doesn't necessarily lend itself well to doing live streaming of worship. So you may want to think about how can you light the front of your building better. That's probably a second step, though, to figure out, okay, is this worth it? Can we technically do it? Can we cross these technical hurdles? And then think, okay, we can, and we're finding some success. A next logical step would be to do some lighting upgrades in your sanctuary to give you a little bit better look. as far as that goes. So I'm going to cut away here for a minute and show you kind of what I mean by a speed test, because that really is the most important thing. So I'm going to go ahead and go to speedtest.net. It does some checking for me, but it's pretty soon ready to go, and I'm just going to click go. Now, again, I am wired in. I'm on Verizon. I have gigabit service, so I'm going to get really, really fast speeds here. But you don't need this level of speed to do live streaming. You need something that is fast. You can see on mine. So mine came at 538 for the download speed. It's going to give me somewhere in the 400s probably for upload speed. So in this case, I would be fine to do live streaming off the machine that I have right here. But if you do this and your upload speeds are coming up less than 10 megabits per second, I wouldn't even really start to think about trying to do live stream video until you had called your internet service provider and had them take a look at it and figured out what can you do. Can you upgrade? Can you improve your package? Because under 10 is really running a risk of just not being able to maintain a solid state. So that's what I do. I'd start with your speed test, see what you've got as far as connection and what kind of quality you're dealing with there, and kind of work backwards from there. There's no point in investigating any of the other things if your internet connection won't support that kind of long-term streaming. So what I would suggest is once you've watched this video, if you've got further questions, drop me an email. Let me know a little bit of what you've got. If you've done a speed test, you know what kind of connection you're dealing with. You've got a camera, you've got a soundboard. So much of this depends on kind of your space and your internet connection and what you already have and what the people in your congregation know, that you've kind of got to take a good stock of your inventory. And then together I'm happy to help you kind of plot some next steps and some strategies toward how you can implement this in your congregation. So see my contact information there. I do commend you for even looking into this. This gets technical really fast. It gets into some detailed tech stuff of HDMI capture and encoding and bit rates and all kinds of stuff. Stuff that I find way too exciting. But I'm happy to kind of help walk you through it. I do think out of this, our ability to integrate more fully technology into our ongoing ministry presence is going to be critical to congregations that wish to thrive and to continue to engage those in their community. So I'm happy to help in any way I can as your congregation tries to figure out some of these technical hurdles. Last thing I'll say is I am a good source on this. I'm not the best. There are definitely people who understand this stuff better than I do, who do this professionally. You can get a company to come in and look at your setup and do an assessment and give you a bid and a quote. That's not necessarily a bad idea. If you do that, please let me look at the quote. I've seen some quotes that are great, where they've really addressed the needs, addressed what was needed. Others I've seen where they've way overshot with like high-end professional gear and just $5,000 devices and huge cameras and things that were just so more than the church even wanted. So if you do get a quote from an outside source to do this professionally, please send me the quote and I can kind of let you know whether they're giving you what you really need or whether they're trying to get you to go with something that's way more than what your congregation actually needs at this point. So again, any questions, let me know, and good luck.